Everyone thought it was just another quiet Saturday morning. The sprinklers were hissing on trimmed lawns, kids were pedaling their bikes down the cul-de-sac, and neighbors waved politely as they hauled in groceries. But on our side of the street, something felt different. You could see it in my son's eyes. 16 years old, standing taller than the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, yet still carrying the same restless energy that always got him into trouble. The call came in before I even knew something was wrong. Not to me, but to the police. And do you know who made it? The HOA, the same people who had smiled at me in board meetings, who sent those pastel-colored newsletters about community spirit. They saw my son in the driveway, working on his pull-ups, blasting music on an old speaker, sweat running down his back. They saw a teenager, loud, reckless, disrespectful, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the weight he carried. They didn't know why he pushed himself so hard. I remember watching from the kitchen window as the first cruiser pulled in. Blue lights bounced off the houses, neighbors stepped outside, arms crossed, eyes narrow. My stomach dropped. What were they doing here? Why were they here for him? My son froze, towel slung over his shoulder, confusion in his face. One officer stepped out. He didn't shout, but the authority in his voice cut through the air. "Son, we got a call, need to talk to you for a minute." And just like that, everything shifted. What do you do in that moment? As a parent, your instincts scream to protect. But part of you also knows sometimes protection isn't a shield. Sometimes it's letting the truth come out slowly, painfully, in front of strangers who already believe the worst. The HOA president had followed behind, clipboard in hand, always the clipboard. She gestured broadly toward my son as if she had caught him mid-crime. "This is what we've been dealing with," she said. "Noise, disruption, aggressive behavior. We can't have this kind of intimidation in our community." Aggressive, intimidation. The boy standing there was sweating from workouts, not fights. He hadn't touched a drop of alcohol, hadn't vandalized a thing. But the words sank like stones, pulling him down into the image they wanted others to see. And here's the part they didn't know. The part that I kept quiet because sometimes silence is safer than explanation. My son wasn't just exercising for fun. He wasn't just trying to look strong. He was training for something bigger than himself. Because inside that house, just behind the curtain they never dared to look past, were men who had trained him. Men who had worn tridents on their chests, Navy SEALs. Brothers in arms who came to our home to mentor him, to prepare him, to mold that restless energy into discipline. But of course, the HOA didn't see that. All they saw was a kid blasting rap music, muscles straining, chin barely clearing the bar of the pull-up rig bolted to our garage frame. The officer looked between my son and the president. His face was neutral, unreadable. My son opened his mouth, but no words came out, just silence. And in that silence, 1,000 judgments were written. Neighbors whispering, kids pointing, phones raised, recording the scene like it was entertainment. I stepped outside finally, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't shout, didn't argue. I just walked up, placed my hand on my boy's shoulder and said, "Is there a problem here, officer?" For a second, everything paused. The officer tilted his head, measuring the situation. The HOA president puffed herself up, ready to recite bylaws and noise ordinances. My son stood rigid, eyes burning with shame and confusion. And that's when I realized this wasn't about noise. It wasn't about community rules. This was about perception, about fear of what they didn't understand. What they didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that they weren't just staring at a teenager. They were staring at someone being shaped into something extraordinary. And soon enough, the truth behind that training, the men inside our house, the reason my son pushed himself past exhaustion, would come crashing into their perfect, manicured world in a way they never expected. The first question wasn't from the officer, it came from my son. Low, shaky, almost swallowed in his throat. Did I do something wrong? That broke me, because I knew what he was really asking. He wasn't asking about music or noise complaints. He was asking if his worth had already been judged by people who never took the time to know him. 16 years old, still carrying the scars of being the odd one out. The boy who trained instead of played video games, who read books on mental toughness while others traded tick dances. The officer shifted, clearing his throat. We got a call, concern about disturbances, loud music, possible confrontation. His words were measured, official. But his eyes softened for just a second, glancing at my son's shaking hands, the sweat still dripping down his forearms. He didn't see a threat. He saw a kid. The HOA president, though, wasn't satisfied. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if confiding in the officer, but loud enough for the neighbors to hear. This boy has been a problem for months. He slams weights, yells, carries on at all hours. I've had complaints. It's not safe. Safe, that word stung. Safe from what? From discipline, from effort, from the sight of a boy fighting against every ounce of weakness in his body. I wanted to speak, but I didn't. Not yet. Because in moments like this, sometimes silence carries more power than shouting. The officer glanced toward me. Sir, is there anyone else at home? Anyone who can confirm what he's been up to? And here, where the story should have ended. I could have explained it away, told them my son was just exercising, nothing more. That we'd keep the music down, that we'd respect the rules, and maybe they would have left. But that's not what happened. Because right then, the front door opened. And out stepped a man who carried presence like a storm. Broad shoulders, calm eyes, close-cropped hair. He didn't say a word at first, he didn't need to, you could feel it. Authority, experience, the kind that doesn't have to be proven with shouting or threats. The neighbors went quiet. Even the HOA president faltered, her clipboard dropping slightly in her hand. The officer straightened. Sir, are you? Yes, the man said simply, his voice low but steady. I'm with him. He nodded toward my son. The officer's expression shifted again, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. He didn't know exactly who this man was, but he knew enough. You don't mistake the bearing of someone who's been through fire and come out steel. The HOA president tried to recover. And you are. The man finally looked at her. No anger, no hostility, just a calm that somehow carried more weight than any argument. A friend of the family, training him, making sure he's ready. Ready for what? She demanded, almost scoffing, as if the idea itself was ridiculous. The man didn't answer, not directly. He just turned back to my son, clapped a hand on his shoulder, and said quietly enough for only us to hear, "Keep standing tall, don't let them shrink you." And in that moment I saw it, my son's spine straightening, his eyes lifting, his breath steadying. That quiet encouragement did more than any defense I could have given. The officer nodded slowly. Well, seems like everything's under control here. I just recommend keeping the volume down, that's all. And just like that, the tension began to break, but not for everyone. The HOA president's face burned with frustration. She wasn't satisfied with a simple noise warning. This wasn't about music. It never was. It was about control, about reminding us where we stood in her neatly organized hierarchy of manicured lawns and painted shutters. But she didn't press further. Not this time. Not with the weight of that man's presence still hanging in the air. As the officer returned to his cruiser, as neighbors slipped back inside, as the HOA president scribbled notes furiously on her clipboard, I caught my son's expression. Relief, yes, but also something deeper, a flicker of pride, a glimpse of who he was becoming. And I realized then, this was only the beginning. Because the truth wasn't out yet. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know the other men inside that house. They didn't know what kind of strength was being built in plain sight, disguised as teenage rebellion. And when they finally did, it wouldn't just change how they saw my son. It would change everything. Why is it that silence always feels louder after a storm? The police car rolled away, its lights fading into the curve of the neighborhood, but the echo of judgment lingered in the air. The neighbors' curtains twitched as they retreated, whispers threading through their walls like smoke. And in that quiet, my son's breathing was the only sound that mattered. Quick, uneven, the rhythm of a boy who had just stood trial in the middle of his own driveway. I wanted to pull him inside, close the door, shut the world out. But before I could, the HOA president's voice cut through the evening air. "This isn't over," she snapped, her pen scribbling furiously across her clipboard. "We'll be addressing this formally. Count on it." My son flinched. Not from the words themselves, but from what they carried, shame. He wasn't a rule breaker, he wasn't reckless. But in that woman's eyes, he was already guilty. I turned to him trying to find the right words, something that could calm him, something that could erase the picture of blue lights bouncing off his face. But before I spoke, the man who had stepped outside earlier, quiet, steady, immovable, met my eyes. He gave the slightest shake of his head. Don't explain, don't defend, just trust. So I stayed silent, and we walked back into the house together. Inside, the air was different. Still charged, yes, but not with judgment, with discipline, with purpose. 3 other men sat in the living room, relaxed but watchful, as if they'd been through storms like this 100 times before. Men who carried stories in their scars. Men who had known danger so real that the HOA's petty complaints would almost seem laughable, if not for the way they cut into my son's spirit. "Everything all right out there?" one of them asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. The man who had spoken to the officer nodded. "Handled, for now." My son collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders trembled, not from fear of the cops, not from embarrassment about the music. It was deeper than that. It was the weight of being misunderstood, of being seen as a problem when all he wanted was to prove himself. One of the men leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think that was hard? Good, let it be hard, because this..." He gestured toward the window, toward the world outside. "This is nothing compared to what life will throw at you. If you can't hold yourself together when they misunderstand you, how will you hold yourself together when they're depending on you?" The words were stern, but they weren't cruel. They carried a lesson my son needed to hear. He lifted his head, eyes wet but burning with something else now: determination. That's when the truth began to unfold in my own mind. This wasn't just about push-ups or running drills. This wasn't just training for fitness. These men weren't here to build a body. They were here to build resilience, to shape a boy into a man who could stand when the world tried to knock him down. And I wondered, did the HOA president have any idea what she was really trying to stop? Later that night, after the men left, I sat at the kitchen table with my son. The house was quiet again, but neither of us was ready for sleep. He stared at his hands, calloused from hours on the pull-up bar. "Dad," he whispered, "why do they hate me so much? I'm not doing anything wrong." I reached across the table, wrapping my hand around his. His fingers twitched like he wanted to pull away, but he didn't. "People fear what they don't understand," I told him. "They see effort and call it arrogance. They see discipline and call it aggression. But son, the truth doesn't live in their eyes. It lives in yours." He swallowed hard, his throat tight, but in his silence I saw acceptance. What I didn't know then was that the HOA president wasn't just making notes. She was making plans. Plans to push harder, to rally others, to prove she had the power to control what happened in her neighborhood. And soon, her fight with my son wouldn't just be about music. It would become something much bigger. Something that would force every secret inside our house into the light. The letter came first, neatly folded, tucked into an envelope that looked harmless enough, sitting on our doorstep like any other piece of mail. But I knew the moment I saw the HOA logo stamped across the corner, it wasn't harmless. Nothing from them ever was. My son was the one who picked it up. He held it like it burned, staring at his name written in block letters across the front. Not mine. His, 16 years old, and they were already targeting him directly. When he opened it, his hands shook. The words were cold, clinical, wrapped in legal language that made ordinary frustrations sound like crimes. Violation of noise ordinance. Disturbance of community peace. Repeated aggressive behavior. They even threatened fines, suspension of privileges, and if non-compliance continued, escalation to law enforcement again. My son's jaw tightened as he read. "Aggressive behavior," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I was doing pull-ups, that's it." I could see the shame settling in again, heavy as stone. But this time there was something sharper underneath, anger. That evening the men came back. Not for me, for him. They didn't even need to ask what happened. They saw it in his eyes. The biggest of them, towering calm, his presence like a wall, picked up the letter and skimmed it. Then he dropped it on the counter like it weighed nothing. "Paper," he said simply. "Ink, words on a page, that's all it is. Don't let paper control you." But my son wasn't convinced. They called the cops. They made everyone look at me like I was some criminal, and now this. How am I supposed to just ignore it? The man leaned closer, his voice low, steady, but with the weight of command. You think being misunderstood breaks you? Good. Let it break you now here in safety. Because one day the world will misunderstand you on a scale you can't imagine. And if you let their words decide who you are, you'll fail before you even begin. Silence followed. My son stared down at the letter, fists clenched, chest heaving. Slowly, the anger in his eyes shifted into something else. Resolve. Training the next day was brutal. Push-ups until his arms gave out. Runs until his legs threatened to collapse. Drills that pushed not just his body but his mind. And every time he faltered, one of the men was there, not to catch him, but to remind him why he couldn't quit. Pain is temporary. Shame is temporary. But the man you become, that's forever. I watched from the porch as sweat poured down his face, as he bit back tears of exhaustion, as he pushed past every limit he thought he had. And I realized, maybe this wasn't just training for him. Maybe it was training for me too. To learn how to let him fight his battles, to stand back and trust he was becoming stronger than the world's judgment. But outside our little world of workouts and lessons, the HOA was preparing their own campaign. Flyers were slipped under doors, warning neighbors about disturbances from our house. Whispered conversations spread at the mailbox. The president even called for an emergency meeting, rallying people with phrases like protecting the community and ensuring safety. Safety, that word again, twisted into a weapon used not to protect but to divide. One night after training, my son sat on the back steps, staring at the sky. His muscles trembled from exhaustion, his shirt clung to him, but his eyes were steady. "Dad," he said softly, "why are they doing this? Why do they care so much about me?" I sat beside him, the night air heavy with crickets. Because strength scares people. Because when they see someone willing to go further, to endure more, it reminds them of everything they're not willing to face. And sometimes, instead of learning from you, they'd rather tear you down. He didn't answer right away. Just nodded slowly, his jaw tight, as if filing the words away. What neither of us knew then was that the HOA wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The emergency meeting wasn't just about rules. It wasn't just about noise. It was about drawing a line. And soon, the whole neighborhood would be forced to choose which side of that line they stood on. The meeting was supposed to be civil. At least that's what the flyer said, Community Concerns Forum. Printed in bold, taped to mailboxes, slipped into door frames. But the moment we walked into the clubhouse, I knew it wasn't about concerns. It was about control. Chairs were lined up in neat rows, neighbors whispering, eyes darting toward us as though we were carrying some contagious disease. At the front stood the HOA president, clipboard in hand, posture rigid with the kind of authority that isn't earned but demanded. My son shifted beside me, his shoulders tense. 16 years old, walking into a room where every adult had already judged him. He didn't look at anyone. He just kept his chin tucked, eyes straight ahead, the way he'd been taught in training, ignore the noise, focus on the mission. The president wasted no time. "We've had multiple complaints," she announced, her voice sharp, cutting through the room. "Loud music, aggressive displays, intimidation. This behavior is unacceptable in our neighborhood." She paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. Neighbors murmured, nodding. Others looked uncertain, shifting in their seats. Then she gestured toward us. "This family has been warned. The authorities have already been called once. And if this continues, we'll have no choice but to pursue further action. None of us should feel unsafe in our own community." Unsafe, again that word. My son's fists clenched on his knees. His breathing quickened, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was enough for them to twist into guilt. I stood ready to defend him, but before I could open my mouth, a deep voice rose from the back of the room. "Unsafe." Every head turned. One of the men had followed us in. He didn't stand at first. He just sat there, calm, collected, arms crossed over his chest. But when the silence thickened, he rose slowly to his feet. His presence filled the space in a way no clipboard or bylaw ever could. "You're afraid of a 16-year-old boy doing pull-ups in his driveway." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. That's what you call intimidation. That's what you call unsafe. The president sputtered, her face flushing. Sir, this is a private matter between the HOA and its residents. I'm a guest in that house, he interrupted, his tone steady but unyielding. And I've watched that boy push himself harder than most grown men ever will. He's not intimidating anyone. He's trying to become something strong, something disciplined. Something this world needs more of, not less. The room fell silent. My son's eyes widened. It was the first time one of them had spoken openly on his behalf. Until now, they'd stayed in the shadows, letting him carry the weight alone. But now the truth was bleeding into the open. The president's lips tightened. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The man smiled faintly, but it wasn't a warm smile. Someone who's seen real intimidation. Someone who's walked into places where you don't come out unless you earn it. And I can promise you, what that boy is doing out there, that's not a threat. That's hope. Gasps rippled through the room. Some neighbors leaned forward, intrigued. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. The president tried to regain control. Regardless of your background, this neighborhood has rules, and no one is above them. Rules, the man repeated, his tone sharp now. Rules are supposed to protect people, not break them down. If your rules can't tell the difference between a kid trying to better himself and a criminal act, maybe it's your rules that are broken. The silence that followed was electric. My son sat, his eyes burning with something new. Pride, not the loud kind, not arrogance, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes when someone finally speaks the truth you've been carrying inside all along. The meeting ended in chaos. Some neighbors clapped quietly as we left, others whispered angrily, and the president scribbled furiously on her clipboard, her jaw set in stone. But I knew then the war had shifted. This wasn't just about noise complaints anymore. This was about power, about who got to define what was right in our neighborhood. And for the first time, my son wasn't standing alone. Because now, the men in our house had stepped into the light. The letter this time wasn't folded in an envelope. It came delivered by hand, knocked on, dropped, and left on our porch like a warning. Heavy paper, stamped with official language that tried to look more powerful than it really was. Notice of noncompliance. Subject to legal action, daily fines will begin immediately. Potential referral to county authorities. I didn't even have to show it to my son. He already knew what it said. He could feel the pressure in every glance from neighbors, in every whispered conversation when he jogged down the street. The HOA president wasn't just fighting us anymore, she was trying to break us. That night my son's anger finally spilled out. He slammed the letter on the counter. What do they want from me? To stop training? To sit inside all day so they can feel comfortable? His voice cracked, frustration choking the words. I'm not hurting anyone, Dad. I'm just trying to get stronger. I could have told him to let it go, to stop before things got worse. But before I spoke, one of the men, the one with the quietest eyes but the hardest stare, answered instead. They want you to quit, because quitting is what most people do. They see pressure, they fold. They see resistance, they back down. But you, he pointed at my son, his voice sharp as steel, you don't get to quit, not if you want to be ready for the life you say you want. My son froze, chest rising and falling, fists clenched at his sides. Then, without a word, he nodded. The training that followed was different, harder, harsher. It wasn't about weights anymore. It wasn't about pull-ups or sprints. It was about breaking him, pushing him so far into exhaustion that his mind screamed for mercy, running until his legs shook, holding his breath underwater until panic clawed at his chest, carrying sandbags until his shoulders gave out. And every time he thought he couldn't go further, every time he thought he had reached the end, they gave him one command, again. One night long after the neighborhood lights had gone dark, I watched from the back porch as they made him crawl across the wet grass, mud streaking his arms, his shirt soaked through. He collapsed halfway, gasping, tears mixing with the dirt. I can't, he whispered, his voice breaking. The biggest of the men crouched beside him. Then stay down, he said simply. Stay down and let them win, let them define you. My son shook his head weakly, sobbing, "No." "Then get up." And somehow he did. That was the moment I realized the HOA had no idea what they were fueling. They thought they were crushing a teenager, but all they were doing was feeding the fire inside him. Meanwhile, the president escalated her war. Letters turned into fines. Fines turned into threats of liens. She sent emails to the entire neighborhood, painting us as disruptive, unsafe, dangerous. Some neighbors avoided us now, crossing the street instead of waving. Others whispered support quietly, but never out loud. The isolation grew, and yet inside our house something else grew too: strength, grit, a boy reshaping himself into someone the world couldn't break so easily. One evening, after a day of punishment drills, my son sat on the porch steps, his arms trembling, his eyes raw. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Dad, why does it feel like the harder I try, the more they hate me?" I swallowed, fighting the ache in my chest. Because strength shines a light, and when people see it, they have two choices: stand in it or hide from it. Some choose to hide. He nodded slowly, breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And I saw it then, the faintest spark of something unshakable. The HOA thought they were closing in. They thought their papers, their meetings, their threats were cornering us. But what they didn't see was what those men saw, what I was beginning to see. A boy becoming unbreakable. And soon, the day would come when that unbreakable strength would no longer stay hidden. The knock came after midnight. Loud, sharp, angry. It wasn't a neighbor this time. It wasn't a letter on the porch. When I opened the door, floodlights cut across our lawn, and half a dozen uniformed county officers stood there, hands near their belts, eyes scanning like they were stepping into a crime scene. Behind them I saw her, the HOA president, arms folded, lips pressed into a triumphant line. She had finally done it. She had dragged the law to our doorstep. My son appeared behind me, barefoot, sweat still clinging to his body from late-night drills. His eyes went wide at the sight of the lights, the guns, the authority standing at our door. He froze. The lead officer spoke. "Sir, we received multiple reports of possible unlawful activity at this residence. Noise, disturbances, unknown individuals entering and exiting at odd hours. We're going to need to come inside." Unlawful, the word hung heavy. My son's breath hitched. He glanced at me, fear creeping across his face. Not fear of guilt, fear of being misunderstood again, but this time with consequences he couldn't walk away from. The HOA president smirked in the shadows. But before I could answer, one of the men stepped forward from the living room. Calm, unhurried, he moved into the light like it was nothing. His presence changed the air in an instant. "Evening, officer." His voice was steady, polite, but it carried weight. The officer stiffened, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place a memory. "And you are?" The man reached slowly into his pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open. The badge inside gleamed under the floodlight, its insignia unmistakable. Not local law, not county, higher, federal. The officer blinked, caught between instinct and respect. "Training," the man said simply, tucking the wallet away. "That's what's happening here. Nothing unlawful, nothing dangerous, just training." Another man stepped into the doorway. Then another. All of them with the same presence, the same gravity, the same quiet authority of men who had walked through fire. The officers shifted, their suspicion wavered. Recognition rippled across their faces. Not one of them asked for more proof. They didn't have to. The HOA president's smirk faltered. "This doesn't change the fact that this boy has been disruptive." "Boy," the tallest of the men stepped forward, his voice sharp now. "You see a boy, we see a candidate, a future. And while you're wasting energy writing fines and calling cops, we're giving him the one thing you never could." He paused, his eyes locking on hers. "Purpose." The room went still. My son's chest rose and fell, his eyes wide, his lips parted as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. For months, he had carried the weight of their judgment, wondering if he was wrong, if he was broken. And now, these men, these warriors, were standing in his defense, not in whispers, not in secret, but out loud. The officers glanced at one another. The lead cleared his throat. Looks like there's no violation here. We'll be on our way. And just like that, the floodlights cut off. The cruisers pulled back. Silence returned. But the silence wasn't the same as before. The HOA president stood frozen, her face pale with rage and humiliation. Her clipboard hung useless at her side. For the first time, she had no words. My son stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "You thought I was just noise," he said, his eyes locked on her. "But I'm not. I'm more than you'll ever understand." It wasn't a shout, it wasn't defiance, it was truth. She turned, storming off into the night, her power crumbling with every step. Inside, my son finally exhaled, collapsing onto the couch. One of the men clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. And in that moment, I realized the fight wasn't just about surviving the HOA anymore. It was about proving that strength built in silence would one day have to speak. And when it did, the whole world would listen. The morning after felt different. The neighborhood was quiet, but not in the usual way. No kids on bikes, no chatter by the mailboxes, just silence that carried weight. I stepped outside to grab the paper, and I could feel eyes on me through curtains, blinds shifting ever so slightly. Not with judgment this time, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Word had spread. It always does. People talked about the floodlights, the police, the men who stepped out of the shadows and revealed themselves for who they truly were. Men who had served, sacrificed, carried burdens no homeowners meeting could ever imagine. Men who had chosen to mentor a boy instead of leaving him to drown in the judgment of others. The HOA president didn't show her face that day, or the day after. Flyers stopped coming. The threats stopped too. Silence became her surrender. But my son, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. He didn't strut through the neighborhood proving anyone wrong. He just kept training. Same pull-up bar, same sweat dripping into the driveway. Same music, a little lower now out of courtesy, but never silenced. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, I sat beside him on the porch steps. He had just finished another workout, his shirt damp, his muscles trembling. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of the boy who once asked if he'd done something wrong. They weren't the eyes of the boy crushed by shame and misunderstanding. They were steadier, clearer. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't hate them, not even her. I don't want to be like them, afraid of everything, angry at everything. I want to be stronger than that." And right there, I realized something. The HOA had thought they were fighting against him, against us. But really, they had given him the very test he needed, a chance to prove to himself more than anyone who he was becoming. Sometimes strength doesn't look like winning a fight. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let someone else's fear define you. That night, the men gathered one last time before leaving. They stood with him in the living room, quiet but proud. The tallest spoke first. "You learned more here than push-ups and running. You learned what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be judged, to be pushed down, and you stood up anyway." Another nodded. "Remember that feeling. Because out there," he pointed toward the world beyond our walls out there, "the judgment doesn't stop, but neither does your strength." When they left, there were no handshakes, no speeches, just a quiet clap on the shoulder, the kind that says more than words ever could. Weeks passed. The neighborhood returned to normal, or at least the version of normal they were comfortable with. Lawns were trimmed. Trash cans rolled back in on time. Neighbors nodded politely again, though this time with something softer in their eyes. But in our house, nothing was the same. My son had changed. He was still 16, still laughed too loud at his favorite shows, still forgot to put his shoes away. But inside, he carried something new, a steel that no letter, no meeting, no midnight knock could take from him. Sometimes I catch him standing at the pull-up bar, not even moving, just gripping it, breathing steady, staring ahead like he's already living in the man he's becoming. And I think back to those nights, when the world tried to label him, shrink him, shame him. And I know they didn't win. Because strength isn't always loud. It isn't always muscles or badges or shouting matches in community centers. Sometimes strength is just a boy refusing to bow his head when the world tells him he should. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep going, even when no one claps, even when no one understands. especially then. And as for the HOA, their silence says more than their words ever could. They learned that night, when they called in the law, when the lights flashed across our lawn, when men who had walked through fire stepped into view, that not everything can be controlled. Not everything can be tamed. Because sometimes, right in the middle of their perfect little world, someone is being shaped into something extraordinary. And no amount of fines, no amount of judgment, no amount of fear can stop that.